When people think about Arabia before Islam, they usually imagine deserts and tribes cut off from the wider world. But Arabia was never isolated. It was plugged into global trade, where Roman gold, Persian armies, and African ships all crossed paths with Arabian caravans carrying incense and spices. Kingdoms flourished in the south. Sanctuaries kept fragile truces in place, and cities carved into stone thrived in the desert. The stones, however, preserve an even stranger story. Centuries before Muhammad, the idea of a single high god was already spreading across the peninsula. One inscription in particular captures this belief in a way that reshapes how we understand Arabia before Islam. Stay with us, because the full story of that carving is the revelation waiting in our conclusion. We'll meet that stone soon. This is Armchair Archaeology. Let's uncover how Arabia set the stage for Islam and the reshaping of the Middle East. Before we dive in, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden layers of history, consider subscribing. It's the best way to keep these stories flowing to you.
In distant view, Arabia looks like one endless desert. Up close, the peninsula is a mosaic of very different worlds. In the north lie dry steppes and black volcanic fields where herders guide camels and sheep from one patch of pasture to the next. Far to the south, terraced highlands catch seasonal rains and feed orchards and grain. Along the coasts, ports on the Red Sea and the Gulf pull Arabia into trade with Egypt, Persia, and India. Between these zones sit oases, fragile islands where wells, palms, and markets keep villages alive. Each environment produced its own way of living. Nomads followed pasture and rain, moving herds across long distances. Oasis families relied on dates, wheat, leatherwork, and small trade. Highland farmers engineered canals and cisterns to stabilize crops and support larger communities. At first glance, these lifestyles seem separate, yet in practice they depended on one another. Caravans hired guides from nearby tribes, rested at oases for water and fodder, and sold southern goods in northern towns. Survival meant cooperation across landscapes. Over time, movement carved reliable routes into the sand. Camels traced the same tracks, season after season, until paths worked like highways for goods, news, and reputation. A poem spoken at a market in the north could be repeated hundreds of miles away by the end of the month. What looks on a map like empty space was in reality the peninsula's nervous system, carrying trade and memory between distant communities. Think of it like today's internet cables, hidden lines that look invisible on a map but carry lifeblood across continents. So what rides along those nerves? Goods, laws, or beliefs? This blend of diversity and connection made Arabian society flexible and fragile at once. Competition for wells or grazing could trigger violence, yet the same roots encouraged truces, markets, and shared rules. Later, when Islam called for unity and pilgrimage, its message moved quickly along paths people already trusted. Geography did not only shape survival, it prepared Arabia to influence the wider Middle East. Speaking of ancient connections, imagine holding a piece of history in your hands. Our Ancient Secrets mug was designed with that spirit of discovery in mind, perfect for fueling late-night reading or early morning curiosity. You can find it in our Armchair Archaeology store.
In Arabia, survival meant more than finding food or shelter. It meant belonging to a tribe. Kinship ties gave people security, justice, and identity. Without them, a person was vulnerable to raids or exclusion. But loyalty came with obligations. An insult to one member was an insult to all. A quarrel at a pasture or a theft at a well could spiral into feuds that stretched across generations. Entire genealogies were remembered for the wrongs they had suffered or inflicted. So how do you stop honor from spiraling into endless revenge? To stop violence from consuming everything, Arabs relied on customary law, or urf. This body of tradition set rules for negotiation, compensation, and revenge. Just as important were the sacred months, times of the year when fighting paused. Caravans planned their journeys to match these windows, moving even through hostile territory under the protection of a shared truce. Sacred spaces reinforced the same principle.
The Kaaba in Mecca and other shrines were considered inviolable. Rivals who might clash outside their walls were bound to keep peace within. These sanctuaries were more than places of worship. They became neutral grounds where markets thrived, poetry was recited, and treaties were sealed. At Ukaz near Mecca, merchants displayed goods, poets competed for honor, and tribal leaders negotiated disputes, all under the protection of sanctity. In a harsh environment, such customs acted like social technology. Today we might compare them to ceasefires or demilitarized zones that make diplomacy possible during conflict. For pre-Islamic Arabs, sanctuaries and sacred times provided rare islands of trust in a world where trust was scarce. When Muhammad later preached about the sanctity of Mecca and the unifying power of pilgrimage, his message struck a familiar chord. Islam did not create these customs from nothing. It transformed them into enduring principles that bound faith, peace, and prosperity together.
In the northern deserts of Arabia, life often depended on constant movement, yet the Nabataeans showed that Arabs could also build cities that lasted. Their capital, Petra, carved into the rose-colored cliffs of today's Jordan, remains one of the ancient world's most breathtaking sights. To visitors, the towering facades of tombs and temples looked like works of art. To contemporaries, they were also messages of power, built on the wealth of trade. Petra stood at the crossroads of caravan routes that carried incense, spices, and silk. Traders moving north toward Syria or west toward the Mediterranean often passed through Nabataean territory. Here they paid tolls, bought supplies, and sometimes left with new contacts or ideas. Geography, which seemed barren to outsiders, became the Nabataeans' greatest resource. Roman observers were astonished that a people with so little farmland could grow so rich. The city's survival depended on something even more impressive than its facades. Rainfall was scarce, but Petra thrived because its engineers mastered water. They cut channels into the cliffs, built underground cisterns, and laid pipes that carried water into the heart of the city. These hidden systems fed fountains, gardens, and baths, creating an oasis where nature had provided almost nothing. What seemed miraculous was, in truth, the result of generations of planning. Petra was also a meeting point of cultures. Its architecture blended Hellenistic, Roman, and local styles, signaling to visitors that they had entered a cosmopolitan hub. Merchants, pilgrims, and envoys carried ideas through its streets as easily as they carried incense or silver. Petra eventually declined, but its example endured. It proved that Arab societies could build urban power on trade and sanctity together. Centuries later, Mecca would echo this model, a desert city tied to pilgrimage and commerce, destined to become the center of a new faith. While Petra prospered in the north, the south of Arabia built kingdoms that could rival great states across the Near East. The best known was Saba, remembered in later tradition as the land of the Queen of Sheba. These were not tent polities, they were agrarian states whose strength rested on water, especially the Great Marib Dam. The dam trapped seasonal floods and sent them through a web of canals. Dry valleys became orchards, vineyards, and fields of grain. Terraces supported groves of frankincense, a resin prized at rituals and medicine from Rome to India. Surplus crops fed cities, paid for temples, and supported scribes, who carved royal boasts and tax records into stone. Power in the south grew from the partnership of environment, engineering, and faith. South Arabia also faced the sea. Ports on the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea caught the monsoon winds. Ships carried incense, spices, and textiles to East Africa, India, and the Mediterranean. Rulers of Saba and later Himyar bargained with Rome, Persia, and Aksum. Arabia's far south was already tied to global politics. Prosperity, however, was fragile. Floods and neglect damaged the Marib Dam. When maintenance failed, irrigation faltered. Fields shrank, villages emptied, and families moved north in search of stability. Skills, laws, and rivalries traveled with them, reshaping communities far from Yemen. The failure of one structure redrew the human map of Arabia.
This legacy mattered for Islam's rise. Migrants spread literacy, legal habits, and debates about God well beyond their home valleys. By the time Muhammad preached in the Hijaz, the peninsula had already tested ideas of kingship, sanctity, and trade at scale. The South showed how infrastructure can make or break a civilization, a lesson that still echoes wherever water scarcity shapes politics today. Its rise and fall set patterns that later cities from Aden to Mecca would inherit. If moments like this surprise you and make you think differently about the past, you can now support the channel directly with a super thanks. It helps us keep exploring and bringing these stories to light.
Long before oil, Arabia's fortunes flowed from incense and spice. Frankincense and myrrh, tapped from trees in the southern highlands, burned in temples, scented medicines, and traveled with the dead in funerary rites. Spices from India and Southeast Asia reached Arabian ports, where sailors timed departures to the monsoon winds. The peninsula was not a cul-de-sac. It sat on the busy roads and sea lanes of an ancient global economy. Caravans carried resins north from Yemen along interior routes, stopping at oases for water, fodder, and news. Camel handlers organized departures by season, formed convoys, and shared protection agreements with local tribes. Merchants struck deals that spread risk, like pooling caravans or sharing profits, so even small towns in the desert echoed with Roman coins, Indian beads, and South Arabian inscriptions. Picture a caravan master haggling for camels under the scorching sun, weighing not just the cost of animals, but the trust of the men who would guard them. Trade also moved ideas. At ports like Aden and on islands along the Red Sea, sailors swapped stories in several languages. Travelers carried hymns and folk tales, legal customs and new tools alongside sacks of resin. A merchant who left with incense might return with Egyptian liturgy, Persian swords, or Indian textiles. The desert looked like a barrier. In practice, it functioned as a corridor. These habits trained people to think beyond the tribe. Negotiating across currencies, calendars, and religious taboos required trust networks and shared rules. When Islam appeared in the Hijaz, it stepped onto routes already pulsing with movement. Meccan merchants knew contracts, partnerships, and caravan timing. Pilgrims knew sanctuaries created safe markets. The message of a single community under one God traveled along paths merchants had paved. If that sounds contemporary, it is. Today's supply chains still turn on choke points, seasons, and trust. The same geography that once funneled incense now channels oil and container ships. Arabia's trade did more than enrich the peninsula. It laid the circuitry along which Islam could travel and helped set the tempo for a Middle East that would matter to the wider world.
Arabia did not sit outside history. To the north, Byzantium ruled from Constantinople and relied on Arab allies known as the Ghassanids. To the east, Sasanian Persia backed its own clients, the Lukhmids of Al-Hira. Across the Red Sea, Aksum projected power into Yemen by sea. Between these giants, Arabian tribes learned the skills of survival that come with living on a frontier. Alliances brought gifts, stipends, and weapons, but they also brought obligations. Ghassanid horsemen raided for Byzantium, while Lakhmid troops answered Persian calls. When the great empires fought, their proxy wars scorched the steppe and the oases. Yet the border was not only a battlefield, it was a meeting ground, where envoys, bishops, and merchants traveled together, sharing roads and interpreters. Theology and tribute often rode on the same camel. Imperial contact reshaped local politics. Leaders who once bargained only with neighboring clans now negotiated with governors and generals. Clients adopted imperial titles, minted prestige through churches or fortified towns, and learned how to play rival patrons against each other. Even legal habits shifted, as Arabian judges borrowed ideas about treaties, oaths, and compensation from Roman and Persian practice. Religious currents followed the same lines. Christian missions moved with Byzantine support, while Persian influence exposed Arabs to Zoroastrian ideas and to communities of Jews living within imperial domains. The result was not simple conversion, but a landscape where arguments about God were familiar, and where public rituals signaled political allegiance as much as faith. It's a reminder that religion wasn't just personal belief. It was also identity, diplomacy, and survival. A truth that still echoes in borderlands today. You can hear the echo in the present. Small states still balance between larger rivals, trading favors for security and shaping identity through foreign ties. Arabia learned those lessons early. When Islam arrived, people already understood diplomacy beyond the tribe and loyalties bigger than a clan. The new faith offered a unity that neither Rome nor Persia could supply.
Pre-Islamic Arabia was religiously crowded. Most communities honored local gods, linked to springs, stars, or high places, and many tribes kept portable idols for journeys. Mecca's Kaaba housed multiple images under one roof, making it a shared sanctuary even for rivals who would not share a well. Festivals gathered pilgrims, sacrifices, and markets into the same calendar, so devotion and trade reinforced each other. Alongside this everyday polytheism, a different idea circulated. Poets and oath-makers invoked a creator who stood above the rest, a high god called Allah. For many, Allah felt distant, petitioned in crisis, or sworn by in major bargains, while lesser deities received the regular offerings. Inscriptions from Arabia's north and south echo the same pattern, recording prayers that speak to one sovereign power without abandoning local cults. The Kaaba's special status magnified these currents. Violence was forbidden within its bounds, and sacred months extended that protection outward. Imagine rivals who might kill each other at a well, now circling the same sanctuary, shoulder to shoulder. Silent proof that peace, however fragile, was possible. A caravan could arrive under truce, negotiate debts, hear poems, and circle the sanctuary in a single visit. Peace had a place, a time, and a reputation, which meant merchants could plan and tribes could save face. What looks like ritual from afar also worked like law. These habits prepared listeners for later claims. When Muhammad declared that worship belongs to one God and that the Kaaba should be purified, the shock was not the words Allah or sanctuary. It was the demand to make the seldom invoked high God the only God, and to fold truce and pilgrimage into a single community discipline. The ground had been seeded for generations. The pattern is familiar in any age. Communities blend old habits with new ideas until a moment arrives that asks for commitment. In Arabia, debates carried by Jews and Christians had already primed audiences to hear a stricter monotheism. Islam did not invent the vocabulary. It insisted on its consequence. I'd love to hear what you think. Was the rise of one high god in Arabia inevitable, or do you think it could have gone another way? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them all, and the best ones often shape future episodes.
Alongside local cults, Arabia hosted communities that centered life on a single god. In Yathrib, later called Medina, Jewish clans farmed, traded, and arbitrated disputes according to their own law. In the south, Christians at Najran built churches and sang hymns that crossed the Red Sea to Aksum. Monotheism was not a rumor at the edge of the desert. It was a lived reality woven into fields, markets, and courts. Texts and teachers traveled with merchants and envoys. Hebrew scriptures and Aramaic or Syriac homilies circulated in caravan towns. Fasting, almsgiving, and prayer marked time in households that thought of justice in terms of covenant and commandment. Debates about prophecy, the Messiah, and the nature of God were not confined to schools. They spilled into poetry, oaths, and local politics. One episode reveals how faith and power intertwined. Early in the 6th century, the Himyarite ruler Yusuf Asar, remembered as Du Nuwas, targeted the Christians of Najran. Survivors carried news north and across the sea. Aksum intervened with Byzantine encouragement, occupying parts of Yemen.
a local crisis pulled in two empires and redrew alliances across Arabia. The message was clear to observers on the ground. Religion could move armies as well as souls. These currents prepared listeners for later claims. When Muhammad recited verses that engaged Jewish and Christian traditions, audiences already knew the vocabulary. The Quran's conversations with the people of the book made sense because people had heard scripture before and seen its laws applied. In Medina, a charter that recognized different communities under shared rules fit a city used to negotiated pluralism. Big ideas moved with daily life. Belief traveled with cargo and diplomacy, then settled in households where it shaped arguments about justice and belonging. Across Arabia, growing monotheism set expectations a new message would need to meet and clarify. Islam answered in a register the peninsula already spoke.
Pre-Islamic Arabia is often pictured as a world ruled by warriors, yet much of its power flowed through markets, marriages, and poetry. Merchant families financed caravans, spread risk with partnerships, and built alliances through credit and trust. Reputation traveled faster than camels. Tribes known for fair dealing could open more doors than bands of raiders. Credit partnerships spread risk across households, and trusted brokers arbitrated disputes at caravan stops. Women stood at the center of many of these networks. In South Arabia, inscriptions preserve queens who ruled, judged, and negotiated. In the Hijaz, elite women invested in caravans, managed estates, and arranged marriages that stitched clans together. Mecca remembered Khadijah for shrewd commerce before her marriage to Muhammad, a reminder that capital and character could command influence. Words amplified wealth. At fairs like Ukaz near Mecca, poets performed before traders and chieftains. A well-made ode could raise a tribe's honor, mend a dispute, or ruin a rival's standing. It was Arabia's open-air stage. Imagine rap battles mixed with political rallies, where a single verse could change a tribe's fortunes. In a culture without mass literacy, poetry worked as public record and newsfeed. Verses rode with caravans and reached distant markets ahead of the next convoy. A satirist could cost a chief allies as surely as a bad season could cost him camels. This ecosystem rewarded skills beyond the battlefield. Merchants who could balance risk, women who could mobilize kin, and poets who could persuade listeners all shaped politics. Markets functioned like parliaments in the open air, where prices and pride were negotiated together. Once the new faith began to spread, it entered an arena already tuned to performance and fairness. The Quran meant audiences trained to weigh promises, recitation, and reputation. Its demands for honest weights, fair contracts, and almsgiving resonated with merchant ethics. Its recognition of women as property holders and witnesses acknowledged existing realities while redirecting them. It did not shut the marketplace of words. It claimed it, turning reputation into responsibility and wealth into a trust.
By the 6th century, Arabia lived inside a gathering storm. Byzantium and Sasanian Persia fought ruinous wars that scorched borderlands and drained treasuries. Arab allies felt the strain. Ghassanid horsemen rode for the empire at Constantinople. Lakhmid troops answered calls from Ctesiphon, and frontier oases paid the price when campaigns crossed their wells and pasture. Caravans rerouted, tolls rose, and long-trusted agreements frayed. Disaster also came from nature. The Justinian plague thinned populations across the Mediterranean and shook confidence in established powers. In the south, the great Marib Dam failed after cycles of damage and neglect. Irrigation faltered, orchards died, and families moved north to survive. With them traveled habits of literacy, law, and rivalry that would reshape towns far from Yemen. Religious competition mirrored the turmoil. Jewish, Christian, and polytheist communities disputed doctrine and patronage. Nadran's story still carried weight, and Ethiopian rulers intervened in Yemen with Byzantine blessing. Around 570, Arab memory places an Ethiopian-backed army on the road to Mecca, even leading a war elephant.
The attack failed at the sanctuary's edge. Whether legend or history, the meaning was clear. The Kaaba mattered beyond tribal lines, and powers from across the sea took notice. The peninsula had become a pressure point. Tribes defended honor, merchants guarded routes, and pilgrims sought truce, yet none of the older arrangements could absorb the shocks. The question wasn't if change would come, but what kind of change and who could command it. People were ready to hear a claim that promised justice beyond custom and unity above clan. With Islam's rise, it did not descend on a void. It spoke to traders trained by contracts, to migrants carrying law and stories, to frontier allies weary of proxy orders, and to pilgrims who already knew the power of sacred peace. A message that could bind these threads together was poised to travel quickly and to redefine the Middle East.
Across this journey, Arabia has not looked like a blank desert, but a connected system. Landscapes demanded cooperation. Tribes crafted rules that paused violence. Petra proved desert cities could thrive through water and trade, and the southern kingdoms turned engineering into power. Caravans stitched the peninsula to 3 continents. Empires pressed on its borders, and Jewish and Christian communities argued scripture within its towns. By the 6th century, people accustomed to pilgrimage, contracts, and diplomacy were ready to hear a message that could gather these pieces into one. At the start, we promised a revelation carved in stone. Here it is. In 512, at Zabad in northern Syria, a trilingual inscription dedicated a church in Greek, Syriac, and Arabic. In the Arabic lines appears a name you know well, Allah. Centuries before the Quran, Arab Christians were already invoking one high God in their own language. The idea of a single sovereign deity, the habit of sacred peace around sanctuaries, and the roads that carried faith in commerce were already moving through the peninsula. This does not make any outcome inevitable. It explains why a new message resonated so quickly. It spoke into a world where the concepts, the sanctuaries, and the routes already existed, and then transformed them into a community whose horizons reached far beyond the Hijaz. Arabia did not step onto the stage of world history overnight. The stage was already built. Islam raised the curtain. So, what do you think? Was the peninsula already destined to reshape the Middle East? Or did the new faith turn a crossroads into a center? Until next time, keep questioning, stay curious, and remember, even in the shifting sands of Arabia, the roots of history reach closer than we think.